Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight we are going to be discussing the recent government business reforms that were introduced as to boost businesses and the climate investment climate in the country. This decision came at the heels of the launch of the 2018 World Bank Doing Business Report, which was in October of last year. And some of the questions we'll be asking the panel tonight and to you, our audiences who are watching, we'll be discussing and asking questions on how these reforms affect local and foreign investors. And we'll also be asking our guests here on the status of aftercare services in the country for companies that invest in Rwanda. My name is Dana Mpisi, and I'm part of The Square. On our show tonight, we are joined by Louise Kanyonga. Louise, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Louise is the head of strategy and competitiveness from the Rwanda Development Board. And we also have with us Mr. Fabrice Shema. Fabrice, thank you for being with us this evening, who is the head of Gasabo Investment Company. And as always on The Square, we are joined by our resident panelists. Brenna Namata, great to have you back. You were missing last week.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
And I hope you're feeling better.
I'm much better, thank you.
Great. And Ephraim, as always, great to have you as a resident panelist on The Square.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And before we get into the thick of things, I just want to ask the panelists tonight, and I'll start with you, Louise. The Department of Strategy and Competitiveness is fairly new. If you could just, you're known for being the Registrar General at the Rwanda Development Board for a long time. If you could just shed some light on this new department and what it entails in RDB.
Right. Thank you, Dana. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the show. So strategy and competitiveness is a department that's focused on a couple of key things. One is, driving what RDB's strategy is and looking at what our core areas, our core business areas that are aligned to our mandate are. And that's looking at investments, exports, tourism, jobs, and seeing what are sort of the strategic interventions that as an institution we need to be, coming up with and delivering those to implementation. A key part of what we do, obviously, is making sure that we are maintaining a business environment that is competitive, that will enable our private sector to thrive. And so I guess my daily job is to figure out what is it that we need to do to make our economy and specifically our private sector competitive.
Great.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll be asking a lot of questions based on that explanation, but it definitely sheds a lot of light, not only to us at The Square this evening, but I think to the general public, and it's a very important department for sure. And Fabrice, if you could just tell us more about Gasabo Investment Company and what it does, how long it's been around for.
Thank you, Diana. Gasabo Investment Company, it's a public company registered under RDB. I have a privilege to be a chairman of that company for the past 5 years now. And our main goals is to invest as a private sector in a big project. When I say big, in terms of scales, but also to have a sort of contribution to our economy as a private entity. So we have in the pipelines quite a lot of investment, but for now we started with infrastructure business, which will be started this year, which have a total worth of 90 billion Rwandan francs, and maybe later on I'll be very pleased to give more detail about the project.
Very interesting. So as you know, Louise and Fabrice, you're here on The Square this evening because we're discussing business reforms that the government recently introduced. This was at the heels of the World Bank Doing Reforms, World Bank Doing Business Report that took place last year. And the reforms are scheduled to be reviewed at the end of this month, if I'm not mistaken, the end of April.
Well, yes, in a sense, that's when that's our cutoff deadline. But then, yes, and then there's a period of assessment, and then we know how we performed in October. So close to the end of the year.
Close to the end of the year. And you're here as well with Fabrice, so we could hear from in terms of doing these business reforms? Someone who's actually in the private sector, how they affect you as a local investor, and also from a policy perspective, Louise, to shed light on that. So my first question, and Ephraim and Berna, as resident panelists on the Square, feel free to follow up with your questions after this first question, is some of these reforms focus on key areas that affect businesses, as you have rightly informed the public, such as ease of starting business, of obtaining construction permits, access to electricity, amongst other things. If you can just shed light in general about these reforms and how they aim to impact, the expected impact on the business ecosystem in Rwanda.
Yeah, so I think, like you said, it's good to start with an understanding of what the framework of the Doing Business report is, the rankings, and getting a sense of what it is and hopefully what it isn't, and to understand why we place a lot of importance on it as a government. So the Doing Business report, which is a publication of the World Bank, really looks at understanding the relative ease of doing business across, I think, 190 economies. And so it's more of a comparative tool that looks at the different procedures and regulations that businesses have to encounter throughout their life cycle. And so it looks at, like you said, starting a business, what it takes to run a business, grow a business, and if it comes to a point when you have financial difficulties as a business, how to close the business. And it does that by tracking 10 sets of indicators. And the idea behind the rankings, which is why we believe it's a very useful tool, is that it gives you a very good sense of the kind of regulatory and institutional efficiencies that you need to put in place so that you can build an inclusive and an equitable private sector type of growth. So a lot of the focus of the tool is on regulations and institutions. And seeing how those can be, what can you do to make sure that you're either deregulating where that's affecting business, or where you're regulating to make sure that you're putting in place mechanisms that make it easy for people to do business. And this year has been a very active, exciting year for us in terms of the reforms. We've continued to do what we do every year, which is drive reforms across all those indicators. From starting a business all the way through to insolvency. And the idea for each of these is, for instance, when you're talking about starting a business, one of the key things that we have seen that the reforms have done for us is grow the size of our formal economy, which obviously then translates into better protections for business, because then they have access to things like, social security protections, they have access, to credit, all the benefits that come with being in the formal economy. We've seen, exponential growth in the number of firms that are entering into business every year since the reforms. So this year, what we're doing is... And
when since the reforms you're talking about?
Well, I think we started following up the reforms in 2008. Yes.
So 10 years.
Yes.
More or less.
Yes. It's 10 years. That's actually very important. It's 10 years for us this year. So this year, what we're doing, I don't know if you want me to quickly go through some of the things, but I think, like I said, like starting a business, where something that I think the businesses are very excited about, I hope Fabrice is,
Sure.
is, trying to gradually transition away from using the EBMs, which I know are a big pain point for most of our businesses.
Very expensive, very complicated for some people.
Exactly.
Now we're trying to get them.
So we're transitioning and using online software, and most businesses are saying, where was this 10 years ago? Yeah. So that's a very welcome reform. We're also looking at some very I think extensive reforms when it comes to commercial properties being constructed. So if a business needs to put up a construction, there's about 3 reforms that are going to cut down the costs by over 2.5 million for businesses, cut down the number of time that it takes by about over a month. So things like geotechnical studies and topographic surveys are very costly. In enforcing contracts, which is also a very big part of what businesses have to encounter, is typically there'll be disputes. And so, one of the biggest issues we've had is that it costs quite a lot to go through the judicial process, mostly because of attorney fees. And so we've introduced small claims courts for any disputes that are under 5 million, because these are relatively small disputes. They should be handled with a much more flexible, more watered-down judicial procedure. So with these kind of courts, you can even self-represent. You don't need an attorney. There's court-supervised mediation. You can have a mediation process instead of going through the court, the conventional court, litigation. And then finally, resolving insolvency. We have a whole new insolvency law that's there, and the key message that we want to drive with the insolvency law is how do we put in place very strong and clear mechanisms for business rescue. So once a company is in financial distress, we need to have very clear mechanisms that can help that company get out of distress, if at least that distress is signaled early enough. So if you look at the reforms, it really touches on the different points of the life cycle of a business, from setting up and going all the way through things like even just getting access to utilities, water and electricity, major reforms there. A couple that you might be interested in is obviously, online applications to be able to get electricity connected, but also the utility is going to start measuring the reliability of electricity supply, because I know that's one of the things that businesses have told us is, yes, there's a lot that has been done, but then the reliability, we've got lots of outages, power outages.
I think the reg is, in terms of outages, they're there to actually measure and actually reimburse, well, to a certain degree, in a certain system.
Yes, the utility, RURA should be able to enforce sanctions. The regulator should be able to enforce sanctions on the utility where there's outages that go beyond 10 minutes or so.
Exactly.
Because these are things, especially if you're looking at the manufacturing sector, an outage, is a huge cost to their business. And so we want to start looking at addressing issues around the reliability of supply.
If I can ask you something very quickly before my colleagues chime in. Fabrice, you've heard what our head of strategy and competitiveness at RDB has said.
Yes.
As a business person for the last couple of years, how have these reforms affected you? And actually, what are some of your reforms that you think can actually be improved? Right now, here talking to the institutions that are in charge of pushing for these reforms, what are some of them? How have some affected you, but how are some able to be improved by the necessary institutions?
Yes. Maybe I can just put one comment on RDB side of reforms. Generally, the reform they are doing are great. So for the country or for a good conductive environment for business, they are very great. But when it's come to implementation, that is starts getting harder to implement. We know it's a journey, so it doesn't happen in one overnight. But for myself and maybe other private sector colleagues, we can ask RDB to see the way of implementation of those reforms. In one sense, the reform is good. We can attract many investors, local and foreign investors. But at the end, what next after the reform? This is more important. Because the reforms, we can have a good system in place. We can have a good jurisdiction, if we say it. But who are the institution or the person in charge to reinforce those kind of reforms? We've got many challenges sometimes. When you come to government institutions, and we don't know exactly who is supposed to do what. The reform is there in place, clear written. Sometimes you get good ranks from the World Bank, but at the end, it's a matter of implementation. So this is a kind of conflict, I can say.
Can you give some concrete examples whereby you've been affected by the implementation phase of these reforms, directly affecting your business?
Let me say the part, for example, for local investors, if I can say that. Most of the local investors, they are aware that there is reforms, for example. For me, the RDB staff or maybe an institution in charge should make more extra miles to inform those private sector or businesses around how the reforms can bring more competitiveness in their businesses. So awareness is very important, because when we're talking reforms to our public servants and the private sector, we hear it from the radio or from the TV that there is reforms there. But how, myself as a private sector, I can get more advantage on the reforms in place? We talked about the electricity issues, for example. As a manufacturer, I would be happy to get an explanation why I can have cut of electricity for 2 hours. This will affect the costs of my production. Maybe sometimes you can work on batches. Some of the batches, you have to destroy the batches.
Yeah, because of power outage.
And that power outage there, it's something that most people goes and claim to RDB. But we know RDB is not an institutions who regulate the electricity. But we should have some people who will really bear the cost. What's happened when you have electricity issues or failures? Those are the things, if I raise my voice as a private sector, sometimes the other side of RDB, I don't have someone who can hear my voice.
Yeah.
And it's become unfair somewhere.
If I would love to add to that, you know, if I'm to ask Louise, granted she doesn't represent the whole of RDB, but if I'm to ask Louise why all of a sudden we are implementing new reforms, it's because a World Bank ranking came out and we were 112 in something, 113 in something, 115 in something. And for me, the question has always been, why are we waiting for World Bank to tell us things that local investors or even just business people in the community can tell us? And I feel like even when we get a good ranking and are ranked third or are ranked fourth, we then fold our hands and are like, the private sector, why are you complaining? We're ranked third. And I think for me, my main issue is that it's necessary that we implement reforms. It's necessary that we address these issues, and actually a good job is being done. But I feel like we're focusing on, well, at least we are paying attention to the wrong source to determine whether we reform our private sector or not. The World Bank doesn't, as an entity, does not sell tomatoes in the market. The World Bank doesn't own a supermarket. The World Bank is not the one that's going to repair shoes. Or there are business people in this community that I feel RDB should use those as the trigger for reforms.
Or the benchmark.
Yes, and benchmark and trigger, because I feel like if you hear an entrepreneur say, I'm failing to get electricity, that's enough for you to start. Not a ranking from World Bank that says you're 112 because you're unable to, then you're like, oh, World Bank has said that we're not ranked highly because of this, and then that's what we're going to address. And so for me, the reforms so far, and I think actually they're really good reforms, but I feel like it's a double-edged sword, because yes, the World Bank report does help create indicators for us to improve, but then what happens is that when we do get the good ranking, and you see it in some areas, there's a bit of laxity, and to a great extent where even the private sector is told not to complain because we are ranked third.
Brenda, would you like to comment on that before we take it back to Louise?
Absolutely.
Is there something you'd like to add to that?
Yes. I think RDB has really done significant work in terms of addressing the soft issues, in my view, which in most cases increase the cost of doing business. You know, for instance, reducing the bureaucracy around the paperwork, which normally fuels corruption, in a way reduces the cost of doing business. But if you talk to the private sector, the kind of issues that they feel the focus should be is reducing, for instance, if it's the cost of energy. What is RDB doing? Okay, they don't generate energy, but how are you addressing issues around the cost of production, which in the end will affect the competitiveness of the products that I produce?
And that's because the indicators of World Bank don't match the indicators on the ground. Yeah. So instead, RDB is focused on the indicators World Bank produces versus what the actual entrepreneur is facing. Sorry to interrupt, but
yeah, just to finish on that. So, in the end, yes, it is good that we are working on the policy environment. We are reducing the bureaucracy, but I think there has to be focus on ensuring that the private sector finds it much easier to produce competitive goods. And I think we have a problem there.
And you're saying right now the hindrance to that is basically the cost of production.
If you look
For instance, if you look at energy, if
it's the cost of energy, if it's the cost of credit, I wish we would see, RDB move beyond benchmarking around World Bank to say, okay, in the last couple of years, 10 businesses have opened and credit has been an issue. And this is what they're saying. We haven't seen that.
Yeah.
So in the end, what you have, like he mentioned, is we are focused on what the World Bank is measuring.
Yeah.
And I think
I feel like the reforms are like studying for a test. Like you go to school to pass an exam. No, it's very serious. Instead of actually studying to educate yourself. So instead of building policy and reforms to grow our economy, we are improving reforms because we are concerned about a ranking.
But in all fairness, one of the things, Louise, this is a load that we're unloading on you.
Nothing we haven't heard before.
Exactly. One of the things, I don't think we're really benchmarking ourselves so like 100% to the World Bank doing business reports. I think there's some instances whereby RDB and many other institutions in government actually sit with local private investors.
They do.
And they have quarterly, at least on a regular basis throughout the year, and make some reforms based on this direct.
Do they? You see, you need to be careful with your words here. And you talked about implementation.
Yes.
It's always good for Twitter, and I know I'm going to be crucified for this.
Public relations.
You find they'll be like, we're going to the east to Kayonza. Sorry, we're going to Kayonza, and we're going to meet with the private sector there. Pictures will be taken, posted on Twitter. An engagement happened with the private sector. If you talk to the business people in that community,
like 2 weeks after, for instance,
the same day, 1 hour, 1 minute after RDB has gotten into the cars and gone, they'll be like, nothing has been discussed, no problem has been solved, or it was just for optics. And I say that and she's smiling, but it's true. So you find that there is consultation, but the question is, what triggers the action? And for me, I still feel like we're using an international ranking to trigger the action. There is involvement from these consultations, but I don't believe that's where the main trigger is. I feel like it's still an external thing where somebody else. Again, I'll say this. There's an African saying that says, you're a dirty person if you clean your house when you're expecting visitors.
Yes.
The fact of the matter is, are we genuinely ensuring that our private sector and the reforms around the private sector are good for the private sector, or are we just doing it because we hear that we have not been ranked as highly and we want to attract FDI?
Over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been cleaning our house, for many years now, and well before the World Bank came in, and I think that it's good to have these different viewpoints. Some of them anecdotal, some of them can be proven, some, but these things are not mutually exclusive, right? So to say that we place importance on the World Bank and the doing business rankings does not mean that this is going to be the magical pill that is now going to resolve all the issues that the private sector faces. And I think I tried to make the distinction very clearly about what the doing business indicators look at, what they can and what they cannot do. But I think that, and Diana tried to explain this, and I think maybe she can even take my job from, she can do my day job quite well.
I doubt that.
But, you know, the thing is that this is one of the different tools of engagement, of understanding what is it that you need as, you know, for your private sector to grow. It cannot in isolation, you know, address the issues that the private sector does. And I think as a government, we would have failed our private sector if we just look at the doing business tool and you know, sort of to the exclusion of hearing from the ground. And that's something that I think also RDB has become very cognizant of, at least in the last few years, is to understand that the indicators and what they track at a macro level are very important. I mean, these are things that do not require rocket science. Whether we go and talk to our private sector, whether we listen to the World Bank, the same issues would come up, right? So things like if it took you, if you wanted to start your business, if it took you, you know, 10 months to do it, if, Diana, for you to start your company, you needed the consent of your husband to be able to do that. If you had to spend, you know, $500 for, those are the issues that would come up. And they'll still, if it was impossible for you to be able to access credit because, one, you don't have any property rights, you don't have a title on which you can transact, the banks have absolutely no confidence in your economy. They have no way of securing their rights. They have no way of, you know, recovering efficiently. They would have to go through 10 years of a court process. If we didn't address those things, they would be a problem for business, right? So regardless of the source, we believe that these are actually things that affect business. And that is important in and of itself, and it's something that we need to focus on. Also especially because I think we all know how highly influential the tool is. It's one thing for us to reform and look at what our businesses need, but the benefit of being compared across other economies, the weight of a publication from the World Bank and the signal that it sends to investors as to where they should invest their capital is something that's extremely important for us to be able to focus on. Now, like I said, that cannot be something that we then say is, you know, done and dusted. I can say, okay, I've done my job. Our private sector is now competitive. Reforms, listening to the private sector, and then reforming based on what they're telling us is a continuous engagement. It's a never-ending business.
But don't you think
we have to? We have to, and we do listen to what they tell us. And when you say that we go to listen to, you know, people in the north and the east and the west and Kigali purely for the PR, I can give you what actually, you know, we do record these issues. Over the year, we've had about 203 issues that have come up from engaging with investors. Through these, you know, going out also through the open days
the year,
that we
just
have.
this first quarter of the year?
No, over starting from last year.
From last year, okay.
And of those 204 issues, we've been able to the satisfaction of the investor, resolve about 74%. So maybe, you know, some of these things are more of a perception.
But the question I have is, aren't we putting the cart, and this is what I'm saying, aren't we putting the cart before the horse with some of these things? You know, when you think about some of the challenges that some of the investors face, they stem, and I know Charlie, if he was here, he would talk of it, institutional, lack of institutional coordination.
Yes.
We go and we put these, and again, I think that's what RDB is trying to work on. It's trying to help institutions communicate better, remove a lot of the red tape. But you find what happens is that you guys will engage with the private sector. You will talk to them. But City of Kigali has not got the memo. Rura has not got the memo. And you find a situation where you make a promise to them or you listen to them, and they were made promises by somebody else from another institution that did not adhere to what you guys are claiming on the table. And I think for me, that's what I'm saying. Like, at the end of the day, what comes first? Is it a situation where we say, look, for the sake of institutional efficiency, for the sake of government efficiency, we're going to do things this way for the sake, or are we going to be like, look, we have been told, and again, I know you've said that there are many indicators and there are many areas where you get your sources from, but I'll keep repeating that it feels like it, and again, maybe you say it's perception, but it feels like this was the indicator.
No,
it feels like
actually there are so many, you know, if you were to go a little bit deeper into the methodology, there's so many things that the World Bank will be looking at in a particular indicator. They're actually coming up with that methodology that year, and this is something Rwanda did 5 years ago. Case in point is the work that we did with the land registration systems, having complete all parcels in the country titled, mapped on a digital platform, available online. These are things we did years before the World Bank realized that this is something that's important. So I think, like I said, it's...
And what informs, if you don't mind me asking, what informs a decision like that when a reform is put in place for that? What currently informs? I know there are many sources, but just in that particular case, what informed that decision to do that?
The decision on the titling. Very simple economics, property rights. You cannot. We had an economy where people didn't have any actual right to any property, and so you couldn't do any business, right, on the basis of any property right. So
it's also measured in the index.
It's measured.
It's measured.
Cost of electricity is measured by the way.
Yes.
We have to look at
a link.
And I think RDB's response, at least to a lot of the challenges that you bring in, is, I think we strongly believe that for most things that are impeding the competitiveness of our economy, we require a private sector response, right? And that could mean anything from aftercare, resolving issues, to bringing in investments that are going to address whatever the issue is.
Which is something we're going to definitely discuss after the break, the whole aspect of aftercare and the criticisms of it in terms of how it is actually practiced in Rwanda for local and foreign investors. So we'll be back after the break. Please stay tuned.
I know.
Many people have been asking what we have been up to. Well, we have told the different stories from decision makers, but this time round it will be different. We will be getting head to head with various influencers and get to the heart of the matter. It is not an easy ride, but we'll endeavor to get you there. It will be insightful, informative, and at times we will agree to disagree, because we are the bridge to your leaders.
Welcome back to The Square. We just took a break. Tonight we're discussing the business reforms in Rwanda and what they mean for the investment and business climate in the country. With us we have Louise Kanyonga from RDB, Head of Strategy and Competitiveness, and we also have Fabrice Shema from
Yes.
Gasabo Investment Company, who's here as a private member of the private sector. So right now, before the break, we were discussing aftercare. There's been a discussion that aftercare, following up on businesses after they invest, is lacking. There's more to incentivize businesses, but there's little that is done to actually follow up on them and facilitate them based on whatever issues they have to actually remain in business. I don't know if this is something you'd like to start
Yes,
with?
of course.
As an active participant in the private sector.
Okay, maybe first we have to congratulate RDB for the reforms.
Absolutely.
Because the reform gives a visibility of the country, in the size of microeconomy, but also the investors, the potential investors who want to do business in Rwanda. And once we get a feeling from outside, people ask about Rwanda. And the World Bank, maybe, I hope, they've read about the report from the World Bank. And now the issue is this. If I come to invest in your country, are you sure that I will get A, B, C, D, as stated in the incentives, for example, for the business? And we say yes. So we've seen a lot of people, just because, for example, we can register a business in less than 6 hours, that can motivate any business person in the world just to come and register his company or her company in Rwanda. But what happened after the registration? There's a series of questions which falls down, and we don't have maybe someone in RDB to really inform a person before you register a business. Let me give you a very clear example here. If I go to register a company today, automatically I'm tied to be accountable for tax.
Automatically.
That means if I don't have my declaration at the end of the month or at the end of a quarter, I'll receive, not maybe receive a call from RRA.
You'll be fined.
But I will
You
get
will be
fined.
fined. Whether they
Pay
call
them
you or
money.
not, to be there in the
And
system.
then I say, okay, I just opened a company, I'm preparing myself to start a business, but what is this?
At the back of your certificate, there is a
At the
list
back
of
of
tax
the-
obligations.
But some of these people are coming from the
Yes,
informal
yes.
sector to the formal sector.
the
They
formal
can't read.
sector.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, yes, but now you know that they put at the back of the form.
So you don't see
No, you
it.
don't see it. Yeah. Also, you sign without yeah.
But it's better to tell someone, look, you have opened your company, but make sure there is some rules and regulation you have
you
really
adhere
to.
Yeah.
So, for me, the issue is not just to get fined, but it's also a matter of education. I've seen a lot of people come to open a company and go back to their countries to mobilize resources. By the time they will come back, they will receive first the fine before even they start. So it's about also education.
Yeah.
And this goes the aftercare service, where RDB, I suppose, they should inform people.
Yeah.
And try to be more proactive than waiting for claims to come.
Yeah.
So ask someone, how should I assist you? I'm not talking only about foreign investors, but even local investors. And today, she mentioned that now we are going to use the online EBM system.
Yeah.
If you take a number of business people here in Rwanda, how many of them have access on internet, for example?
Yeah. That's true.
Although the RDB is pushing to have even non-Android ways of putting the EBM, how many people have you said going to Kayonza have Android phones? So we need to think quite further to see, even before starting calling foreign investors, how are we treating our local investors? At the end of the day, if you want to become a knowledge-based economy, it's just about knowledge. Those private sector people we have on the ground, most of them, I know them. If you find, for example, how many businesses have reached the university levels. I think
Very
there are
few.
very few.
Very, very few.
So when you're putting all reforms, but try also to understand that we have more than 90% SMEs,
Yes, it is.
which are, I'm sure 100%, they don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So that one is the challenge. And if you want to increase the visibility of local investors, I think RDB should, I don't know how to really restructure the institution itself, but put more people to look after the local investors as well. My feeling is like you have RDB focused more on foreign investors.
Actually, I find it very interesting that you've said that, because a lot of what you said before we actually came on this show, we talked to different people, we did our research, desk, online, and just, face-to-face interviews with people in the private sector. And a lot of them, but I'll let you first answer the first question before we dive into this, Louise, about aftercare services. But there's this apparent, idea that people have that RDB or various government institutions, they'll roll out the red carpet for international, foreign investors as opposed to local investors. There's a bit more hand-holding compared to their local counterparts. And this is something that I think we'll take on. And of course, there's some in the private sector. You had to bring it up. But before...
about aftercare. About aftercare, I just want to throw in something.
We need to let her answer.
Yeah, I will. And actually, to help, to come to her defense, actually.
You're actually coming to her defense?
Yeah. once in the evening. No. But, and I was telling her about it, you'll find that other institutions, coming back to this lack of coordination, other institutions will go make promises to investors. And we see this often. They go make promises to investors, and then they hold RDB accountable for that. So you find a situation where, I'll give you just a short example, a situation where, for example, somebody has a plant and wants to set up, wants to buy some new machinery to expand the plant. He will ask and say, he'll go to Reg and say, guys, they've sent me to you. I want to know if I can buy this machine. Is the capacity of the transformer enough for me to buy this kind of machine? Give me advice. And what normally happens, you find somebody will be either lax or is misinformed and says, no, go ahead, you can buy any machine. The machine will come. The capacity of the machine is larger than the capacity of the transformer, and the machine sits idle. The person took a bank loan, is suffering. Then RDB will organize a meet the business community in that area. And this business person will come and say, you guys told me I can go buy this machine, and now it's just sitting idle. And that's the issue that I think it's RDB's, now that's where it's their responsibility to ensure that they can create an environment where there's coordination with all the institutions that it works with in delivering these reforms. Yeah.
Louise, would you like to answer on the aftercare issue?
Yeah, I think you all raised very valid points. I think it's a conversation that we have had before. It's criticisms that we've had before, and I think especially for not just RDB but for the country at the point where we are, which is really an inflection point. The kind of growth that we're targeting, that some have called crazy high growth. To put ourselves on a path to become, a developed economy by the year 2050, high middle income by the year 2035. We also realize that RDB, that we just need to really rethink our approach to investments and make sure that we're looking at it as a end-to-end approach, right? So from, like you said, being able to attract people, to incentivize people to come in, to putting these deals together, and all the way through to aftercare. And understanding that aftercare is extremely strategic, not simply to help investors get their projects off the ground and get them off the ground quickly, and not have these kind of issues that you're talking about, but also because in any modern economy you'll find that about 50% of their investments come from reinvestment. So it's extremely important for us to make sure that we're taking care of our existing investors. And yes, in the past, I think we have had structural issues around aftercare, and I think that we're now really trying to revamp the services, give it that strategic understanding that this is really about driving reinvestments. It's important to address the micro issues. Someone has a land issue, someone's got a, the kind of issue that Ephraim described, but also understanding strategically, how do we support you as an investor to export more, to reinvest more. And so we've done a few things, some of which Ephraim doesn't think are very useful, but I think it's good to have this as a starting point and see, is that responding to the issue. So, we've had the domestic campaigns across the country, which, to Fabrice's point, were really to take away the perception that RDB is more focused on foreign investors. I think there is nothing in both our processes or our regulations, incentives, and otherwise that is in any way skewed in favor of foreign investors. But there is this perception that persists, and so we need to address that. So going throughout the country, trying to get investors, local investors, excited about the opportunities for investment that we have, but importantly, understanding what are the issues that they're facing and how can we help them to resolve them. We have the Investor Open Days that happen every Friday, 9 to 12. We have, like you said, the Meet the CEO forums that have happened. Yeah. And really, it's important to understand that what was driving all of these initiatives is for us to get to understand what our private sector needs, but to get closer to our local investors mostly. And we hope that either it will teach us what the issues are, or it will help us also to refine and evolve these kind of aftercare engagements. But I think, it's important to also just appeal to our private sector. I completely agree with Fabrice that we need to be more proactive, and this is us trying to be proactive. In the past, we might have been reactive to a large extent, but as we're being proactive, as we're getting out there, as we're opening our doors up every Friday, we're seeing that over 60% of the people that are coming to us are foreign investors. And so I just want to make that strong appeal to the private sector, to also take full use of some of these initiatives that we're coming up with, and maybe it's important, as Ephraim said, as we're engaging, let's understand, does this mechanism of engagement work? I did mention this a little bit earlier, that we also are seeing the need to move away from addressing macro issues and starting to understand some of the micro issues at the farm level, engage with them. And we've started, looking at starting with the champions in certain sectors and actually going to them. So, for instance, going to Africa Improved Foods and asking them questions like, we're still seeing that a huge part of your inputs are being imported. What can we do to make you source locally more and more? And the challenges that you get are, things that you would never know sitting at a government desk. And so it's extremely important for us to get out there. We've talked to quite a few champions in textiles, in manufacturing, in ICT, etc. And what we realize, which is why I said you all raise very valid points, is what Ephraim said, is that a lot of the issues cannot be resolved by RDB. Yeah. And so we need to come up with very strong coordination and escalation mechanisms. How do we make sure that some of the issues that we uncover require policy reforms, some require just a very quick tweak here. So how do we make sure that across government these are escalated and given the importance they have? And it's only through engaging that you realize that these are the issues and this is how best you can fix them. So we're really thinking about these escalation mechanisms across government and seeing how they can work.
If I could just come in, we know that RDB takes stock of investors, and by that, I think every quarterly basis you have registered investments that are coming into the country. Annually, we get results. The report we don't get is how many businesses have actually closed. We don't get to know why they're closing. And I think if we were to find out, okay, why we registered 60 billion, it would be interesting for RDB to also tell us that actually of the 60, maybe 20 billion has actually come in. And of the 20 billion, maybe 5 have seen their 5th birthday. Yes. How come, this is lacking in terms of your... And the reason I ask this is because there seems to be a focus on tracking people coming in.
Sure.
But in terms of what these people do when
Yeah.
they're on the ground,
Yeah.
and what happens,
And for how long do they actually stay?
And what happens?
To give a practical example about that, there was an issue recently or sometime last year about a foreign young entrepreneur, where an immigration issue made him leave, and he was bringing in a medical innovation, and he was investing his own money.
Are you aware of this case?
I don't think she is, and I say this because you find that. Again, not to take anything away from Louise or RDB, but I feel like, again, sometimes there's just so much, and right now the priority is coming in and handling what's there. So you find there's so much that seeps through the cracks, coming back to what she says, that if possible, actually I think that could also be a good source. Why are businesses closing? Very good. That could be a very good source for reform.
Liz, what do you want to say?
Yeah, I think, again, obviously we are very keen on getting more businesses to birth. And I think it's important that the focus remains there, that we are creating opportunities for businesses to get into the sector and to grow. So in terms of being able to track how much is actually being invested, that's obviously done. It cannot be, given the nature of data, it's not done on a quarterly basis, but it can be done on an annual basis, and we do have this data from the BNR national accounts. So we're able to track, and the reason, and it's actually extremely important for us to track what's actually being invested, because that then is the basis for your incentives. So the people who are managing incentives need to see, did you actually invest this, and then, so yes, we are able to track that. We have actually recently partnered for the reasons that you mentioned, which are very valid. We've done some initial work with the International Growth Center, IGC, trying to get better data management, better data to understand farm performance. Because, again, like I said, a lot of this information is not within RDB. It's looking at how our farms actually performing on the ground, and we've gotten that data. So we're now able to start to look at trends and see, at an individual farm level, at a sector level, what are the trends in terms of actual performance? And that a lot of that is using tax data and maybe social security data as well. So this is something that I completely agree with you. It's something that we're starting to track to see entry and exit trends. We actually, when we did some, we had an initial sort of like a pilot system. And one of the things that we actually said that would be very good to include in that system is to get some feedback on why certain investors exited from the economy. Because I cannot, you cannot overemphasize how important the feedback of investors is, because investors speak to investors, and fellow investors have a much more convincing effect than a government official. So I think it's extremely important feedback. And I know that I did say that we're really starting to look at this end-to-end approach for investments. A big part of the middle that we are now starting to boost, and a lot of work has been done there, is what we're calling deal acceleration. Because once you have an investor interested and they come in, there is a lot of support that you need to actually get that deal operational.
Do you apply the same for local investors?
There is absolutely no discrimination. What RDB focuses on, and which is important for an economy because of an ecosystem issue, is we focus on attracting investments of scale. Because investments of scale is what is going to build the ecosystem that SMEs thrive on, right? Because if you have a major investor, then you'll have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 SMEs that are supplying some service or the other to a major investor. An investment of scale is going to address a lot of the competitiveness issues, some of which Ben has said, cost of production. If you have economies of scale, a lot of these costs come down. Huge job creators, major export creators. So we do have to, put a lot of effort in bringing in investment of scale. When we're talking to our local investors, we try to encourage them to come together, because honestly speaking, if every single person wants to set up their small shop, we will not attain the kind of growth that we need. So we need to see even local people coming together.
But you see,
no, let her finish.
No, but I need to ask this. I need to ask this question.
It's never really about foreign versus domestic. I think our laws, we even actually did make a huge overhaul of our investment code to remove. Yeah, we removed the investment threshold, because before you had to invest $100,000 to be able to be considered an investor. That is something that the private sector told us is problematic. We listened, completely removed the threshold and said, okay, let's not focus on threshold. Let's rather focus on what are you investing in, and is it aligned to our national priorities, which is then when we came up with an investment code that is focused on priority sectors. So today, if you're in developing some sort of ICT application software, you can access, incentives. You can access a 15% preferential corporate income tax without having to show that you've invested even $5,000. So it's a strong perception, and I think we need to keep listening to the private sector to see why does this perception persist. But in terms of the procedures, the treatment, there really is no discrimination.
My question was just a clear. The belief is that local investors, which I want to clarify, are small shops.
Yeah.
And I want to clarify this, and probably he can support me on this. And you have the data.
Yeah.
You at RDB, you sit with it. Some of the large investments
are local.
Absolutely. And that's something that also is a perception that a lot of people don't have. The belief is that the reason why international investors, quote unquote, would seem more prefer.
I'll have to stop you there. Louise, this is definitely, we're running out of time. It's definitely a conversation that we definitely need to have here over and over again. I hope RDB will accept our next invitation as we go into the coming days. Thank you very much for being with us, Fabrice.
Thank
Louise,
you so
on
much,
behalf of RDB, it's been an honor having you. Yeah. And please continue with the conversation on Twitter using #TheSquareRW. We've been talking about the business reforms in Rwanda. Please keep the conversation going. We'll be back with this conversation sometime in the near future. Thank you for being with us, and have a good evening.
Thank you.